Well, I'll take advantage of everybody being quiet and we'll go ahead and get started. So, thank you for finding your way back after lunch. Here for the afternoon sessions. We have two sessions. This one on resistance, sport, and human rights, and this will be followed by a 15-minute break. And our final session of the day will look at politics of sport, particularly sports washing and human rights. In many ways, as I think about the thread of what we've been doing to this point, starting last night with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and continuing today through Pablo in our first panel, there's been a common thread of resistance. What resistance looks like, what it doesn't look like, why we seem to have less of it perhaps than we used to have, how we could foster resistance. And so this panel will address some of those questions more directly. This panel is on resistance, sport, and human rights, and it's going to examine the powerful role of sport as a site of resistance and ideally as a platform for advancing human rights. From athlete activism and protest movements to community-led initiatives that challenge systemic injustice, sport has long been a battleground where struggles for dignity, equity, and freedom are fought. By centering resistance on this panel, panelists will invite a critical reflection on sport, not only as entertainment or competition, but as a powerful cultural space, as we talked about in the previous panel, where human rights are negotiated, defended, and reimagined. We're pleased to have as moderator for this panel Dr. Fiona Vernal. She is Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies here at the University of Connecticut. A native of Jamaica, her teaching and research center African, Caribbean, and African diaspora histories. She curates a number of public-facing projects. I believe her most recent project, Museum, just had its opening fairly recently, all of which center oral history as part of its core methodology. Dr. Vernal was awarded the University of Connecticut's Provost Award for Excellence in Community Engaged Scholarship in 2021, and that type of community engaged scholarship is a high priority here at the university. So for Fiona to be recognized for that is high praise indeed. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vernal, and she will introduce our panelists.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This morning and yesterday, we've been having wide-ranging conversations about access and opportunity, about monetization and commodification in sports, about systemic inequities, about participatory rights, but also about the values of community and kinship and presence and political citizenship and reciprocity and the alignment of human rights with that which we hold near and dear in our society. And so I'm really pleased to have this distinguished set of panelists with us. We are down one man. To my immediate right is Kevin Simpson. He's a distinguished professor of psychology at John Brown University. He's the author of Soccer Under the Swastika, published in 2020, which focused on organized soccer in Nazi concentration camps and ghettos, where playing this beautiful game actually meant life and death. He has had multiple fellowships at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, as well as at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. In 2019, Dr. Simpson was a Fulbright Scholar to the Slovak Republic, where he taught graduate courses in sports and psychology and the psychology of the Holocaust. So welcome, Dr. Simpson. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Yetsa Tuakli Wasornu, whose name I wanted to make sure that I pronounced very, very carefully. She's an associate professor and founding director of the Sports Equity Lab at Stanford University, a research and innovation platform that reimagines performance by centering empathy and the creation of healthy sports environments where all people, whether they're amateurs or professionals, can experience the transformative value of sports. Some of those values that have been under discussion, that includes purpose and connection, leadership, learning, and the kind of growth that you get from sports, the very values that bring people in societies together. And then finally, we have son, Charles Haddad, who has graduated from the University of Rochester and fantasized and then won, moved to Cambridge to train for a spot on the 2000 Olympic rowing team. The Oslo Peace Accords, however, presented a unique opportunity to qualify a Palestinian rowing team for the Sydney Games. And so Haddad founded the Palestinian Rowing Federation and served as its president for 11 years. San Haddad is also an author of The File, Origins of the Munich Massacre, a comprehensive history of competing efforts to found a Palestinian Olympic Committee during the British Mandate for Palestine. So I feel honored to be in the presence of our distinguished guests. Our first question, to continue to engage with the themes from last night's keynote and this morning's presentation, is that theme around resistance. In a world where athletes are often told to stick to sports, to shut up and dribble, what does resistance look like on and off the field? Who gets to be the arbiter of that? Who gets to define what resistance looks like?
I actually was a little bit naughty and prepared some remarks that I may just set aside here, but I do want to get to a number of those maybe a little bit later on, in part because they're the actual testimony of people who played soccer under the Nazis. Soccer was widespread throughout the Nazi Empire, and as a response by the captives, the persecuted themselves, there was a declaration of intent in as much as you could do something in a camp or a ghetto, right? There's a declaration of intent of humanity, of purpose, of passion, of also just to deal with distraction. A lot of people don't realize that in these places of immense suffering, there was a need to find ways to occupy yourself. And so when I think about what it means for particularly people who've been persecuted to claim that for themselves, sport is a really natural place for that to happen. And during the Nazi era, it often meant survival, privilege and survival, which is a complicated combination in this time because a lot of survivors came back from the war really unwilling sometimes to talk about these experiences because it would generate uncomfortable questions about, well, if you actually had soccer to play, there must not have been that bad, or the suffering wasn't as serious as maybe we learned in other places. So for me, in my study of this, especially through the lens of psychology, I'm very interested in the victim experience. And so this question of resistance being owned by the players really is, I think, a compelling one. Maybe get us started that way.
See, so I prepared notes too because I know I'm not supposed to go over 10 minutes for answering the first question. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back after lunch. Hopefully you're not too sleepy from all that sugar. So I am Dr. Yesatwakli. I competed for Ghana in the long jump, and I trained in the U.S. So as a result of that, I ended up traveling all around the world, competing in different cultural spaces, and learning how sort of an international, multinational experience of sport really kind of coalesced on a few core values. So my culturally very, very Ghanaian, very West African, jollof rice all day. Ghana jollof rice is better than Niger jollof rice, just in case people were wondering. And Senegal definitely came up with the recipe. But when I was thinking about the question, Fiona, thanks for it, what I wanted to share is that resistance doesn't always mean that we have to stand against something. I think that's a very Western way of thinking about things. There's that competitive us versus them, against, et cetera, whereas at home, sometimes resistance is simply standing in alignment with yourself, with who you are, how you are, and your very nature. And what I've learned all over my competitive days is that athletes, no matter their experience, have a lot in common. We're all dreamers. We're all at the 3, 4, 5-year-olds like, I'm going to be the next Olympian. Okay, yes, maybe. We're all extremely courageous. Taking the French definition of the word courageous, cœur being from the heart. We're heart-led human beings. And in some of the science that I do, what I've also learned is that athletes have a very unique hearing brain. We're able to distinguish signal from noise easily. Why? Because we train for it. We had a symposium last week with Edwin Moses, and he said he would be in stadiums with 50,000, 80,000, 100,000 people. He could hear his own footfalls, the footfalls behind him. He could hear the person taking off and landing. He could hear his own breath. Our auditory cortex is so much better trained than most persons that we are capable of discerning friction and BS from signal. So that's just, I wanted to put that out there, saying that athletes have a lot in common. So when we talk about resistance, I want to take it from two directions. One is against something, I'll get to that in a minute. But the other is just standing in alignment with ourselves and who we are as athletes. I think that in that latter condition, standing with ourselves, resistance is rehumanizing sport, finish. I think sport is holistically oriented by nature. I think if you just watch kids play in Jamaica, in Ghana, in Israel, in Palestine, anywhere, you can see the very simple tenets of sport on full display. It's a healthy tension between discipline, preparation, and improvisation, presence, discernment in the moment. That I'll date myself, but that quote by, I think it was Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. To me, that remains the best encapsulation of sport and life. Like, prepare, be disciplined, take your notes on your iPhone like I did before I got here over the past couple of days. We all have notes up here. But then you get up there and you are in the moment and you improvise. And you figure it out and you go with the moment and you pay attention to the space and the energy. That's sport and life. So I think that if we are to resist in this day and age, sometimes it's simply coming back to who we are as athletes and those who observe sport and enjoy it. And that's the kinship that Dr. Ali Joseph talked about in the last panel. That's the community. That's the holistic approach to humanity. And it's humanity with the healthy tensions that embodies. So that's the first thing. So just saying that resistance is not always railing against the machine, like against the man, like, okay. Sometimes just be yourself and stand unyielding in that. But now let's talk about the other one, because I think that's also interesting. It is easy to think about what we can resist against. And I want to just reference one of my favorite scholars, Herbert Cole, 1991. He put out a little monograph called I Won't Learn From You. It was brilliant, and what he was able to show was that there was a cohort of students that were just coming out of the civil rights movement, post-integration, and these Black and brown bodies mostly, who had been phenomenal at math and science, they all of a sudden started failing. And so we did some investigation. He was like, you were great at algebra before. You were great at geometry before. Why are you failing? And they said in a declaration to who they were, they said, it's not that I can't learn, but I won't from this person because they're undermining my identity, they're undermining my dignity, and they're undermining who I am and everything I stand for. So it's a phenomenon I won't learn from you. Decide who you ingest knowledge from and who you pay attention to and who you imitate and who you don't. So I would say it's a 10 minutes. Thank God. I try to practice it, but I think I was like 11 minutes last time. Oh, what? Thank you. So, thank you. 5 minutes, I'm good. So I would say if we take that framework, that I won't learn from you framework, as athletes and those who observe sport and enjoy sport, we can look at the dominant sort of social mindset that pervades sport. If it's transactional, then we should take a stand for mutuality. If it's dehumanizing, then we should take a stand for humanity. If it's apathetic, then why not be empathetic? Or compassionate, which is empathy in action. If it's extractive, why not be generative? If it's individualistic, then we take a stand for collectivism. I think that resistance as athletes is sometimes saying that I'm not going to just blindly ingest the dominant conditions that I'm being presented with. I know the way. This is supposed to be money and profit oriented. I know it's performance first, but I'd like to be well-being at all costs, not winning at all costs. I think the best example of that was Simone Biles in 2020. Remember, she took a stand for her own well-being as and against that of the institution. It was interesting. So the neurobiology of what she was experiencing, the twisties, she was unable to spatially locate, which lives on the cerebellum vermis. It's a very particular neurobiological condition. It could be fatal for her, and she decided, I'm going to stand against it, and I'm going to prioritize myself, my well-being, my bodily integrity against the institution. That's a good example. Outside of Simone, coaches, UConn, Stanford, in Stanford women's volleyball, community leaders, the leagues, they can also put well-being above winning. And I think hopefully we'll get into that, how they can do it in a practical way as we get through the conversation. But just to say that if we are going to stand against something, I think deciding who you're going to learn from and who you're not going to learn from, which systems you're going to blindly ingest and which you're not, is part of resistance in 2025.
Good
Good afternoon. Thanks for having all of us here. I think that I'll start with who gets to define it. And I think that everyone here at the panel has kept a focus on the individual athlete themselves. And this is really important because it's they who are commodified. It's they who are utilized, used, manipulated by a lot of people in a lot of systems, whether it's economic or political. So it's, always striking to me, and it was always striking to me that people would make an issue of the Olympic gesture with the fist and the black glove, because, this is a minor manipulation of the Olympic platform compared to what goes on to put on an Olympic Games, especially if we talk about 1968 and the things that happened in advance, with respect to the protests that were going on right before. I'm an educator. I'm actually back in sixth grade, social studies, because I have two sons. So I always think about what I say, formerly as an athlete and as a coach for the next generation. And now that includes two boys who are 10 and 13, who happen to have a complex Palestinian American identity with a dad who got stuck here in the US after the invasion of Kuwait, and made this decision to sort of shift from possibly rowing for the US in the Olympics to trying to row for Palestine. And it's important to put out at the beginning of the conversation, especially in the context of the war that's been going on in Gaza for the last couple of years, that the only obstacles to my being able to represent Palestine were the Arabs. I have to say it. I've got to put it out there. I'm sorry. They were the only people who made an issue. Now, is it the people themselves, or is it corrupt institutions or corrupt individuals within institutions? And I really want to pick up on this idea of, how victims have to sometimes just existing is a form of resistance. All right. And no one else gets to define the resistance except that individual. And then also, this idea that you don't have to be against something, but you can act within institutions, and that's a form of resistance too. So not for the purpose of aggrandizement, but there was nothing clean about trying to set up the Palestinian Rowing Federation. It was sticky and it was messy from the beginning. There was rhetoric about peace, but what that really meant, and do we really want a Palestinian rowing like this, that's a little bit countercultural. And again, when I tried to raise resources, when I did fundraising for the Palestinian Rowing Federation throughout the United States, I was always confronted with, why are you doing this? This is a waste of time. Palestinians need, and ambulances and other things. It's like, well, hold on. You're a professor in Chicago, or you're living this very nice life as an expat Palestinian. Your life is very comfortable. When was the last time you were in Gaza hanging out with the kids who were escaping sexual abuse in their households to get into like a rowing program? Like, this is part of the reality. This is one reason why we were able to have 50% parity for girls in the program. Now, this is a very sensitive subject, right? And one of the problems with the rhetoric of resistance is it sometimes refocuses where resistance should be. The people who know how to resist best are the people who are on the ground, and that doesn't necessarily involve the political dimension. There's also societal reform. I mean, we talk about gender equity here, trans rights. This is societal reform, right? We're trying to get politics to come to terms with the reality of how people actually live and exist in their personhood, right? And pouring in tons of weaponry into a situation and saying that's the only solution, okay, we all understand why there is resistance militarily. But there's a whole other dimension of resistance that's important as well. And that's through purposeful expression of individualism. And this is one reason why, as a Palestinian American who is quite involved in, discourse issues around Israel and Palestine. I'm very much against the idea of boycott as resistance in sport. Because let's be honest about where I was when I started, okay? I had a chance to participate, but, anything can happen. You can get punched in the face. You can get the wrong lane and the wrong wind direction in rowing. And I was a lightweight anyway, so I had a long shot chance of making it, right? I was in the single sculls, and we did not have a single lightweight division. We only had doubles at the time, and there weren't any other Palestinian rowers at the time who I could find who were lightweight. We like our hummus and our rice too much, so they were heavyweights. I couldn't row with them. And I looked back. The only prep I did for this was I looked back in the archive in that letter that I wrote to Arafat, and I said, this is what we want to accomplish. And then, it had to do with very unimportant things like winning medals, for recognition, for, the movement, the system. This is the one thing I'm proud of after doing the program in Gaza. None of the kids who went through our program ever joined a political faction. And that includes the nephew of Ismail Haniyeh, the Secretary General of Hamas. So that says something. The one rule we had was sport for the sake of sport. Because in my experience, I had been blocked by every single Arab political structure, including, by the way, the PLO, which didn't want me. They hung up the phone on me. So I went to my boss and I said, look, I got to go to Jordan this weekend and talk to these people. I went to the hotel. I got information from one of the security guards on where they were. I went up and I knocked on the door. And this is a good friend of mine, who answered the door. You go through a lot when you're talking to people who are living these experiences. You accept them for all of their strengths and weaknesses. But, and they accept me for mine. I have plenty of my own weaknesses, right? Including my inability to understand really what was happening at 21, 22, like we think we do. But, I had never actually been to Palestine or Israel. So he opens the door in his undershirt and his underwear, and he's like, who are you? And I'm like, oh, I'm, Hassan Haddad. I'm the guy who you guys hung up on a couple of days ago. And he burst out laughing. And he said, he shut the door. I could hear them talking inside. And then he opened the door. He said, come on in. And we sat and we talked for hours and hours and hours. And he said, we need a couple of things from you. All right. He said, the number one thing is, if you want to represent Palestine, you have to go and you have to live on the ground among us. You have no right to talk about it if you're not there. Now, this is interesting because a lot of people are talking about Palestine. And when I was in college, Palestine was a spell check correction requirement in MS Word. It didn't exist as a term, right? In 93, 94, right? But this is interesting. All of us who have a care about the fate of Jews who live in Palestine, Palestinians who live in Palestine, and anyone else who lives there. I mean, we're all careening towards a catastrophic situation. They need to remember who has the right to speak, first and foremost, about the concept of resistance. And that doesn't necessarily mean the group right now making a lot of issues for a lot of my friends, and a lot of them have died, including some of my former employees, because of what some people did on October 7th. And for me, this is not resistance, this is insanity. What happened. So we have to reconcile that concept. Why it happens, understandable. I can apply many managerial frameworks to explain why October 7th happened. But the Olympic movement and sports is fundamentally a value system. And if we don't stick to values, we cannot define value-driven resistance.
Thank you so much for those opening comments. Whether through your own research or your personal cultural backgrounds, the international and global context of resistance matters tremendously. And I wonder if you could reflect on what that might tell us about how we can frame some of the conversations we're having about sports and resistance in the U.S. Whether through your academic studies. So Kevin, you're working in the context of looking at sports and the Holocaust, or whether from your own cultural backgrounds in terms of your ethnic heritage, your cultural heritage, and the global places that you trained in. What role does that global framework play in how we might think about some of the conversations we're having about resistance in the U.S.?
Unless you have something.
Yeah, I'll just mention some of the research that we've done. Yeah, this is easier. Some of the research that we've done on serial winning coaching. So coaches who have won serially for decades and generations. Here at UConn, you have a few. We have a few at Stanford, the other side of the country. But that research I found quite interesting to speak to Mr. Haddad's comment of values-based resistance. What we found is that serially winning coaches have a series of characteristics in common. And whether or not they are attuned with, again, I'm taking the position that resistance is sometimes just aligning with who you are, rather than ingesting a framework that's presented to you externally. But we found that they typically possess a strong sense of purpose, a sense of playing for something higher, a high degree of emotional intelligence, and they have a leadership style that emphasizes mutual connection and care. That's in every sport. So that it doesn't have to be an individual sport, a summer sport, or a winter sport. So I'm picking up on what Mr. Dodd said when it comes to values-based resistance and the research that we've done on those who are both winning and winning well as coaches emphasizes the importance of some of the points that he was making. So sorry to totally ignore your first point about the frameworks, right? The political framework being important, the dialogue related to resistance. That's gone on for a number of decades now. But I think if we are to start from this perspective and this point of view, then that data I find very compelling.
I feel like you're speaking my language, having been a psychologist now for a number of years. I was actually trained to be a therapist and went the teaching route. You can draw your own conclusions there. Anyway, for me, one of my ambitions at the start of this, yes, I'm soccer mad, coached and played in college and all of that. But for me, one of the major ambitions is to teach the Holocaust. And when I kept coming across testimonies and photographs of this era, I'm always compelled to make sure we keep telling the story, because I don't want those who died, these anonymous, horrible deaths, to go unremembered, but also we have a remarkable legacy of those who played this game in these really awful places. And when I think internationally, when I think about what that history means today, it has to do with some of the values you're talking about. When you look at testimonies, I want to read actually a little bit later on a couple of those from people who played in these places and survived. They do it for very human reasons, like I said earlier. They played because it was camaraderie. It was a way to honestly get privilege and access to a little bit extra food in these oppressive places. It was also just for the love of it, the joy of it. There's a fairly well-known league in Terezin, which is the camp excuse me, just north of Prague, about 45 minutes. And there were levels of play. There were thousands of athletes, both the very youngest and pro-level athletes. This was the camp that the Nazis used as a propaganda tool to essentially con the world that the Jews were being treated well, or at least well enough. The Red Cross visited there, again, which was a scam or a sham visit when it happened. But this was set up as a propaganda camp, and soccer was incorporated into that as well. But when you look at the testimonies, you even look at the video footage, which again is propaganda footage from about 1944, you still see the joy both in spectators and then in the players themselves. So these very human values, I think, help us understand it in a more universal sort of way. I think that matters tremendously. Just want to check a couple of things here as well. There are also stories of kids playing in the ghetto. Again, just kind of pick up soccer. So you have this all over, whether they were Jewish or Polish or Russian or Czech, of course, many other nationalities. They played for the very reasons we love sport when we're little and then when we're older as well. So I think for me, that's a way to understand a little bit of the resistance, but also the human values that unite all of us. I would say why these stories matter, because we could compartmentalize it and keep it in a box from 1933 to 1945, but I constantly come across, especially younger audiences who are fascinated by soccer during the Holocaust because A, they didn't know much about it, and B, they want to know why. Again, when we're taught to see this history as one of just unremitting suffering, and of course it was, but for me, it's these self-directed efforts. Agency was a word that came up earlier in one of the sessions. I think that matters tremendously, the agency to play, but also to survive, because these folks, they realized that if they were able to survive, they're going to be able to provide testimony about what they experienced as well. Complicated testimony, because after the war, now many people talked about this. This is why it's a story that kind of emerged in the last 20 or 30 years. You weren't inclined to talk about your sporting endeavors in a ghetto or a camp because people would assume maybe that you were unfair, or you got unfair advantage, you had privilege, which was true in some cases, or that it maybe wasn't as bad. So that fits very much into denial. That fits into the anti-Semitism of our era as well.
Yeah, I can build on that. Sorry.
That came from the audience.
Oh, yeah. I can build on, I continue on that a little bit more. Obviously, the question of re-emergent anti-Semitism or more public anti-Semitism is a big topic of discussion these days. And I hate to, say it because their values, obviously, there's positive attributes to intersectionality, but intersectionality, when practiced inadequacy, can also be an open door for letting people with any public opinion on a very sensitive topic come into your house and start fighting for it for reasons that have nothing to do with why you're fighting for it. But the issue of boycott is coming up again, even though both parties themselves, and I know because I'm part of the discussion, have agreed they're not going down that path anymore. The leaderships themselves agreed after the 50th anniversary of Munich, we're not going back to the boycott thing. For most of the war, it's been quiet, but once again, outsiders are coming in and trying to make a boycott issue. Now, this is problematic when you start talking about agency and the role of Jews in sports historically. The founder, of FIFA is a Dutch Jew. He built and saved the sport when it was almost bankrupt. He died bankrupt from saving it. Sport was a vital, vehicle for survival for people then. And I understand that, having worked with my athletes in Gaza. These 10, 11, and 12-year-old kids. And for all of us, I teach in DC now. The importance of street sports in neighborhoods in Southeast is essential for letting out steam and tension. I'm not a scientist, but there are tomes on why this is valuable, right, for development. So I think that it's really important to remember that even for all of the shortcomings of the Olympic system and the movement. And I've seen how the politics is made. The sausage, I guess that's the expression, right? It's called the greatest show on earth, I think, for a lot of reasons. I advised in Qatar, I advised in Gaza, and I've researched and written on Israel and Palestine very, very deeply in this file. The IOC defines sport as a human right and has been advocating for the UN to define it as a human right for years. It's an essential aspect of the UN-IOC relationship. So to bring boycott into the picture, for example, today, is very, very challenging because you're basically asking the organization to step away from what it says it represents. Now, the only venue that boycott recently came up in was UEFA. The Continental Association for Football that has a history of burning people in ovens. Not UEFA, but the cultural landscape, right? It's not a surprise that it came up there because we already have emergent polity on both sides of the political spectrum, pointing the finger at the Jew for everything, right? And so this is disturbing. It's interesting to note that the boycott movement is not coming out of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Arab states, even the Gulf states. It's not coming out of there anymore. It's coming out of Western circles. And so I want to refer to what Ally Joseph said in her presentation, or remarks earlier, that when we take on some of these Western colonial concepts and systems and impose them, it can sometimes perpetuate dangerous ways of locals figuring out things on their own terms and through their own cultural mechanisms.
So one of the things I wanted to do was to connect the earlier part of the conversation this morning about systemic inequities and the barriers when you have to work with the IOC or work with the NCAA. I was wondering if all of you could say something about institutional building and the vantage point from which you're coming at this issue. I'm thinking about the Sports Equity Lab at Stanford as an institution and what it has to contribute to this broader conversation. San, I'm thinking about your role as an advocate, right? And sort of stepping back from your own personal ambitions to actually create a space for advocacy for others. And I was wondering if you could also, this would be, I think would be a good time for you to perhaps share some of the testimonies when we circle back to you.
Get to that.
All right.
Maybe
Yeah.
wrap up with that.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. I think we all have our own mics now.
Yeah, we're just sharing this
Yes.
one. So I think as we build institutions, I think the way something starts is the way it's going to go. So it's really critical to understand the reference point that we're starting from and the frame. I had a conversation earlier at lunch about how so much of the safeguarding work that we do, we were either fortunate or burdened to lead the 2024 International Olympic Consensus on Interpersonal Violence and Safeguarding in Sport. It was a 2-year yeoman's effort with 15 global experts from around the world, and trying to convene global experts on a topic internationally is very much like herding cats who are feral and also live in alleys. Like, it was a really interesting conversation and process. But as a result of that, we went through all these citations, the great literature, just everything you can imagine, interviewed athletes from all over the world, interviewed coaches. It was a very big effort. But what we discovered is that the majority of the conversation was framed through the legal discipline, not any health, human rights, public health, or a healing space. It's very much how can we battle this out in court? What kind of policies and legislation can we write down? And the problem with that is when you try to stick a very subjective human experience into a two-dimensional, sometimes one-dimensional legal rubric or box, lots gets lost in translation. Many voices are totally excluded and many experiences completely erased. So that's the first point. So when I'm building my institution, I'm thinking, what is the discipline that we're starting with? And what are the values of that discipline? I'm thinking about health and healing. I'm a sports medicine doctor, kumbaya, healing, everyone should get better. PRP is great, stem cells work. You know what I mean? Like, I'm really interested in people literally healing. That's the way I was trained. I'm interested in listening first, using my 2 ears and my mouth in that proportion. That's the way I was trained. I'm not interested in endless competition and endless us versus them. It's just not part of the discipline. So I think the first question when you're building an institution, and that's certainly the question I've brought to Stanford with me, I've only been there for a year, so I'm just getting started, is what are the disciplines that are foundational to this entire institution and why? So that's the first. Second, knowing that institutions are really into themselves and love bureaucracy, I'm also thinking, how can we insert structures within existing systems that ease the burden when it comes to human rights abuses? Interpersonal violence, of course, is a human rights abuse of all kinds. And so I think about the Norwegian winter sport culture for youth, for example. They have a law that no kid is going to get a medal, a ribbon, or any kind of award before the age of 13 in sport, so that they structure the sports system for youth so that they're doing it for intrinsic reasons, right? That's a great structural solution to an otherwise commodified system where winning and medals and profit is really king. So I think about that a lot too. We were talking about the Serbian basketball culture at dinner last night, and how they focus on the fundamentals. The ball never stays still. They're very interested in creating a structure where socio-emotional learning and fundamental skill development is foundational to all that happens. So as you're building an institution, one could also ask the question, in the institutions that do exist, who hold a lot more power than those who are fledgling and up and coming, how can we suggest structural changes that would ease the human rights abuses and other things that we don't want to see? So I think I'll stop with those two comments. Kevin, do you want to? Yeah.
Go ahead, because it'll actually tell you.
So to stick to the question and not build to make sure that I give an opinion on or response to this, I think for us, we lack that type of data that actually shows how important sport is to youth within our systems. We can point to a lot of analogous, peer-reviewed studies, this, that, and the other thing, but we haven't actually done that work in our communities in an appropriate way to help guide and inform our own policies. And for our situation in particular, we can never escape the facts that we are dealing on the intra-communal level, but then on an inter-community level with the Israelis, who can sometimes be 2 kilometers away. Like some of those closest kibbutzim, who by the way were all the peace-loving lefties in Israel, were 2 kilometers from the border and massacred, right? Like this is the reality, So we need an initiative, and there are different ways that we're beginning in certain circles to have conversations about this, to develop a conglomerate research initiative from institutions that care and are interested to help pump into the equation the reflectiveness and intentionality of research design to help us preserve this space as an important area of advancement and cooperation, not boycott. One interesting concept is to establish a very unique Olympic Academy in Jerusalem as a joint project. Not in the traditional sense, but Jerusalem as an ancient capital in the same way that Olympia is an ancient location, has a lot to offer with respect to that seam line, the Eurasian seam line, and how sports are interpreted in West Asian societies to basically the subcontinent. I think we need to not include Far East Asia in the equation there. And that Eurasian sort of Central European through Turkey and Syria impact. The other aspect is to actually develop a real history of sport in basically late Ottoman Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, and Israel. Because the amount of cooperation is much more than people want to admit today. And the positive role it played is much more than people want to admit today. The only point of argument was who was going to be the president of the Olympic Committee. And the reason we didn't get it was because of the dirty business in my book. You'll have to read about that in the book, right? But they didn't steal it in the way from us as Arabs, as people think that they did, and as is certainly being, claimed. And the person, just to be clear, the person who told me that, who got me starting on that, was the Secretary General of the Olympic Committee of Palestine. He said, if you really want to help Palestine, don't listen to the shit you're hearing in the office. And he gave me a list of archives. I took it to a Jewish colleague who added some additional archives. And I was like, holy crap. There's a lot of dirty business in this archive. We need to publish a real encyclopedia of sports in this region. It needs to be in Arabic and in Hebrew and in French for the Francophile countries of North Africa. And it needs to be translated into a curriculum of sorts that can be used in the younger grade levels about the value of sport, transmitted through an Olympic Academy project that can work with ministries of education to help people understand that we always played with Jews in sport and that they were there and were our neighbors. A Maccabi club won, I believe it was in 47, the National Basketball Championships of Egypt. And people do forget, by the way, that 750,000 Jews were kicked out of Arab countries at the same time that 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out of Palestine, right? So I think we need that type of data. We need accurate historical data. We need current sociological data. And we need some quantitative statistical analysis of the historical data of how many matches and who was winning, because that will tell us something about whether we as an Arab society benefited from the Zionist presence in sports or whether they really were like the enemy that we say they were. My guess is that they were pivotal to helping us grow our own Olympic history.
Can I come in on that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, sorry, he mentioned data, so of course my brain is now, I think honestly, what the research conglomerate that you mentioned is a brilliant idea. I think that one of the things that we should also do as we build these research conglomerates is be very intentional about connecting traditionally disconnected nodes and equally weighting sort of historically less privileged voices and experience. I say that to say that narrative, voice, storytelling, in my culture, in my experience, has always been the way that people transmit knowledge from generation to generation and is extremely powerful. I think we live in a visually biased world, but also a quantitatively biased world, where especially in sports, people really esteem the numbers and the Excel charts and all of the statistics, whereas stories is really where the wisdom is locked up, because there's the difference between wisdom and knowledge. Book smarts is not the same thing as wisdom. And that's where the solutions to really complex problems live. Both my grandmothers didn't go to school, but both of them were medicine women in their villages where there was no running water, et cetera. And their wisdom far exceeded all of our book knowledge combined. All of us, my mom, dad, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, all of us. And so I'm fully aware that knowledge and the scaffolding that provides is of interest, but wisdom comes from lived experience expertise. And so even as we're building institutions, I think we need to be very careful about equally esteeming, equally weighting different ways of knowing, different ways of communicating, different forms of data, and trying to integrate them rather than perpetuating the sort of same old, so as we're building our research conglomerate, we'll keep that in mind. Yeah.
I would begin by maybe reminding or telling you of the good work that's being done by football clubs in Europe, and at the same time acknowledge on the other side of it that there's a really long way to go, because often from the terraces, from the stands, you still hear things that continue to shock, they continue to oppress. What happens in La Liga in Spain is deeply problematic in terms of how African players are being treated, or Brazilian players especially. So there's a lot of work still to be done, but there's one club in particular that's, I think, really notable, and that's Borussia Dortmund. They're led by a particularly progressive, I think, owner and leadership. I also worked in Slovakia as well, and there's one club. It's a tiny, insignificant football nation. Sorry to say, I probably shouldn't have that recorded, but I love Slovakia. But there's a club there who's also doing similar kind of work in terms of memorialization and what it means to be thoughtful in our own day and age with the academy and how they raise up really integrated communities where they are. Long story short, Borussia Dortmund has done a great job of adhering to remembrance, but also reminding us that this is a story that needs to carry forward. So when I hear about this call to remember the stories, I think testimonies certainly are part of that. It's certainly been a tradition since 1945. So when I think of institutions, I think of education, I think of memorialization through remembrance. Yad Vashem and U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and football clubs can do this as well. These are the stories I think that get carried forward and I think that matter tremendously. I'm actually part of a Holocaust Education Committee in Arkansas, and we are one of now 27 states, I think, who mandate Holocaust education. It's kind of generally defined and maybe not as specific, and that's where we get to kind of flesh that out as specialists, as educators, and so on. But to that end, part of the reason I've been drawn to this as a psychologist is that there's an interdisciplinary nature. And so when I think of institutions, I think of the disciplines, of course, that we all represent. And you heard some wonderful ones this morning as well, and that'll carry on this afternoon. And I've been drawn to the stories because that's often a big part of what psychology is, right? The narrative, when it shows up in therapy, when it shows up in the developmental research we do. For instance, I tell my students in my sports psych class, which I'm teaching this fall, you'd be surprised to hear that we don't have a robust body of literature that points directly to a developmental benefit for playing sport, but every athlete in the room knows why they're better as a human being because of self-discipline and self-denial in some cases, and just the pursuit of their sport and excellence as well. So certainly we have some catching up to do in that regard. So if you'll indulge me, I wanted to read this earlier. Some of these survivor testimonies I think are really powerful and remind us of why narrative accounts matter. So that league I mentioned earlier in Prague, or north of Prague in Terezín, again, this is the propaganda camp that the Nazis had for a number of years. He ended up surviving the war. He was a goalkeeper. He was famous for playing for the Czechoslovakian national team before the war. His name is Jurka Tausig. So he's one-time national goalkeeper. He was well known, certainly, to the players of Terezín when he arrived in 1943. And this is how he remembered part of his time playing for the clothing warehouse team. He recalled this in an interview. I think he settled in Los Angeles after the war. We were the Stars of Terezín. Every Sunday afternoon, 3,500 fans came to watch the league matches. Youth saw us as a model to imitate. We gave them hope, and we represented life. In all the misery and suffering, hope was a rare thing. We played for them because we knew that shortly they would be sent east, and we felt that we gave them a little spark of light before their death. There's another pretty well-known memoirist, novelist named Arnost Lustig. He was a survivor of Terezín. He also survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald. He writes actually about his experience playing football in Auschwitz, and we have accounts that are really kind of astounding from Auschwitz, both Birkenau and Auschwitz I, of where soccer was played in both of these places. So he was a 15-year-old boy when he was there interned or captive in Auschwitz. He had witnessed his own father being sent to the gas chambers and his mother stripped nude and paraded before a crowd in the camp. Reflecting on his experience at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Lustig confronted those who might doubt his experiences given the fact that soccer was on offer in a place of such deep suffering. There was no way to tell him about what we also learned in the camps. Once I told him that we played there and I saw the thought go through his head, how could it have been that bad? How could I have explained to him that in that same moment that the SS bet on our games as if they were at a dog or horse races or cockfights? How many people were cremated in between? Or that anybody who injured another player on the field in Auschwitz-Birkenau went straight to the ovens? The player who found another, Nazi-like, went up the flue like the rest. And in fact, it's at the end of his life, Lustig becomes a professor at American University. He was famous for having kickabouts with international players on the quad there in Washington, D.C. He talked about the power of the game to serve as a symbol of resistance. And I do think of the game as a type of institution. He also saw it as a pathway to kind of preserve our humanity. This is what he had to say. And in fact, this is what I wrap up my book with. You can tell my soccer passion here. Soccer is a marvelous game, something between art and exercise, a test of fast thinking, judgment, the ability to combine. It is creative, fast, thinking and imagination predominate. Through soccer, one reaches intoxication like in works of art or sex, fulfillment that boosts your confidence for a bit. It erases or restricts feelings of inferiority. Soccer is a joyous and cheerful game. It encourages those who are playing and even those who are watching. During existential circumstances, when one is under pressure and close to death, soccer turns into a symbol of defiance, longing for beauty, the possibility of living. It's a shame that 99 players out of 100 died and they didn't live to see the end and peace, the opportunity to live and play or to watch soccer. Soccer is joy and peace, a beautiful game that changes life into joy, the gratification of defiance. Thoughts about soccer in Terezín and anywhere else, I would conclude with these two sentences. Let the game called soccer live. While it is played, a person on this earth will still stay human.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing that with us as an oral historian. I'm partial to those kinds of stories myself. I was thinking about what Pablo said this morning about atomization and fragmentation of the media landscape, and I've noticed that no one has brought up AI yet. And so I wanted to sort of ask this last question before we open it up to the rest of the audience, with the possibility of thinking about narrative forms, thinking about testimony, autobiography, biography, thinking about Tommy Smith's book and John Carlos's book, and sort of when they had the opportunity to finally tell their stories so that it could be received. Despite the media atomization and fragmentation, what are the possibilities of having more power and control over being able to disseminate those personal narratives, those your autobiography, having social media to have a space where we do have a little bit of control over how much we want to engage, and not necessarily having our stories of survival and resistance be just something that we hold near and dear to us, but we can take that opportunity to share in our own time, right? And reveal as much or as little as we want. And so I wanted to kind of ingest AI and the media landscape into our conversation and ask about technology and the possibility of it being able to support or enable resistance.
We always turn to you, don't we?
I
So
know.
please go ahead.
It always comes to me, but I guess ladies first. You go second again. This 1, 2, 3. No, we use AI so much in our lab. It's one of these tools that I thank any universal good for, because there's a couple of comments that I'll just leave. So if you think about narrative, and I'm very interested in, again, connecting traditionally disconnected nodes, narrative and story at scale would give us the opportunity to start to codify some of the insights that we've all had about sport anecdotally over generations. And so what we're doing, we have a couple projects. One is the Athlete's Voice project that I really love. This was born out of the IOC consensus labor of love. And again, I do not recommend anybody do that kind of a project because it was just too much work. But what we learned is that out of the about 200 athletes that we interviewed in about 9 different languages, there were so many themes that cut through every sport context that if we had that at scale, let's say 1 million voices, 2 million voices, 3 million voices, then we could start to build a qualitative big data set. So in medicine, we talk about big data a lot, where you have national databases and repositories of data that are fed into from all over the world. What we would like to do is an athlete's version of that, that uses athlete stories exclusively in every language. And when I say every language, yes, there are verbal languages, but part of sport is movement as well. We heard from, again, Dr. Ali Joseph. We keep coming back to your talk earlier today. Movement is ceremony, and there's a language of sport that involves movement only. If you think about most of the sport environments that we experience and enjoy, they are instrumented. So there are cameras everywhere. There are moving cameras everywhere. We've got audio and visual data for most sport environments now. And so imagine, because I don't have time to code all that data, if a machine could, number one, learn athletes' language, not only vocal and verbal and narrative-based, but also physical. And if we could start to code that, what does agency, what does dignity, what does mutual respect look like to athletes all over the world? So I love AI, and I'm really excited to utilize it and deploy it in this way so that we can build a future of sport that truly is athlete-led and athlete-driven. Because right now, and this is just from what I know of AI, it's looking backwards. So it's looking at all the information that's been gathered in the past. Well, none of that includes the stories that Dr. Simpson just read us. None of that includes an athlete-only set of data. And so looking forward and trying to build a more athlete-centered space requires, I think, an analysis of all different types of data and knowledge, verbal and otherwise, going forward. So I'm 100% excited about utilizing AI in this service of a more athlete-centered, empathy-based sports space that is balanced and harmonious globally, rather than constantly listing towards sort of the Western way of doing things.
Okay, so I will build here and connect. So I think, first of all, I want to preface my remarks by saying I'm not really qualified to speak in the area of AI. So for everyone in the room who's a student, I think it's important, to bear in mind that you become an expert, in something, but it doesn't mean you know anything about something else. But we try to apply our thinking skills, right, to how it can be used based on our operational experience. And then we find the reliable counterpart who knows the technical stuff to deal with it. So I think that there are a couple of spaces where this can become very, very valuable. I know a very interesting individual in Chicago who has a proprietary software to actually look at the organizational behavior and culture of organizations, transnational organizations, in a predictive way, so that you can sort of stave off ultimately a corporate scandal. So an example in point is feeding all of the emails from Enron into this software and being able to look at the tone, right? The tonality of intra-corporate correspondence that can then be used to, predict basically a positive or negative outcome to policy making and decision making within an organization. To connect it to personal experience, maybe this is TMI, but I got divorced in the last 3 years. I use a software called Our Family Wizard, and it has a tone detector in it, right? And so it'll flag you whenever you're, maybe constructing something in a way that might be replicating negative patterns of communication that aren't going to keep the children's best interests in mind, right? So you're talking to your co-parent through the emotional experience of the divorce rather than talking to your co-parent about the primary need of the child. And I can see how it's clunky, and it doesn't get it right all the time. But wouldn't it be interesting for the IOC to take on an initiative that measures the correspondence and the communication before it goes out and becomes policy from national Olympic committees and from continental associations, so that it actually adheres to the fundamental principles of Olympism? I don't know if they'd like that, because intracommunal correspondence, intra-organizational correspondence, is very complicated, especially within the National Olympic Committee's relations division. You can kind of think of that division as the business intelligence division. But there's a lot of stuff that people pitch that's pretty nutty that should never be a conversation point, that might be caught before, it becomes a public problem, marketing problem, reputational problem. And so AI could conceivably use to help keep organizational systems that are components in this large transorganizational network more accountable to how they're manipulating the Olympic system itself. I should say Olympic values.
Number 3.
I'm going to begin by admitting that I have no idea how to answer this question, but I will say this. The use of AI will, I think, parallel or enhance what's already being done. For instance, I don't know if you've seen this before, but there are avatars essentially of Holocaust survivors that are being developed so that a host of possible answers have been recorded when they were living. And if they happen to have passed on, then there's a repository of those. So you can walk up to the simulation of the real person and interact in some sort of way. Really creepy when you first see it, honestly, but I think it's going to be in that sort of vein, because we now have tens of thousands of testimonies that have been recorded of Holocaust survivors, and actually comparatively genocide, you know all about this, right? Of survivors of all the awfulness of the 20th century and even today, right? Burma and other places. But I see that kind of as the next front, or the next, no, that's not the best word, the next avenue of pursuit, I guess. How to bring this vast volume, we really do have a vast volume of these testimonies, to an understandable, usable sort of format. I think AI would serve that well.
Thank you so much. I would like to open the floor for questions so that we have enough time to delve into the theme of resistance. Yes, I see multiple hands. Are
throw a
there mic
microphone there.
runners?
We have a few.
Start
One
over.
down there?
Ah.
Okay.
Hi. First of all, I just wanted to note the irony in talking about inclusivity in sports and then talking about AI, which I think the future of AI is actually going to destroy poor Black and Brown communities. So it feels a little bit contradictory to be talking about both things. But of course, that's what these conferences are for. Second of all, I'm an Iranian woman, daughter of Iranian immigrants. My parents had to flee the country. As many of you may or may not know, Iran is a gender apartheid state, meaning that women cannot participate in a lot of the same sports or activities that men can. And that is true of some other countries as well, but not many. And this question is for Mr. Haddad. I'm curious what you mean by boycotting. As someone who hasn't lived in Iran, but who actually can't return either because of the same dangers. The only thing I feel like I can do as an Iranian woman living in America is one, obviously playing sports and doing the things that my fellow Iranian sisters cannot, but also to talk about it and to boycott. FIFA, for example, was boycotted some years ago because of the same gender apartheid question, because women cannot play soccer in stadiums. So soccer is sort of out of the question for Iranian women. What would you recommend that people do instead? And could you actually define what you mean by boycott? Like, do you mean like boycotting sports institutions, or like you mentioned the IOC and how they should make sports a human right? Well, also, gender apartheid should also be criminalized. So that's also something we can boycott and get these institutions to do. So I just like some clarity around boycott, and also what your suggestions are for people like me who hold these issues dear in their heart, but similarly haven't had that experience there, and I can also never have that experience in Iran. I guess that's my question. Yeah, what are your recommendations, and also what is your definition of boycott? Because I'm unclear of what that means.
Sure. The question with respect to what I consider boycott relates to specifically movements to boycott Israel in sports, or in the case just last week in, I believe it's Indonesia, with the gymnasts, to boycott specific, Israeli athletes within, a world championship. So either basically to suspend / expel, right? Like they did with Afghanistan in the 1990s when the Taliban took over, like they did, for example, in South Africa, and basically not allowing Israel to participate. So there is enough out there, right, that advocates for that. Whereas a Palestinian, I thankfully have the luxury to think about it in some other ways as well, because I'm never really going to take wind out of that sail. I mean, it's a big sail right now. But I do think that it's important to have the conversation about what would the negative impacts of boycott be in the long term. Nobody's clairvoyant, right? But there are issues that can influence it. In my case, I faced a lot of opposition to involving women in sport. Our program was actually in Shati refugee camp, beach camp, which is like ground zero, basically, for Hamas in the northern Gaza Strip. But if we had the support of moms, the dad's opinion didn't count. So this is why I say we need to make sure that we're talking on the ground. Now, Iran is a very different situation because it is truly like context to the remarks I'm about to make. I teach organizational behavior and strategy, so I'm speaking the language of business, not people right now. Business architecture, org charts. Iran is the closest model to what the Nazi regime established with respect to the architecture of the state and the involvement of state corporations in the crimes of the state. Okay? So it's a very different conversation to ask someone in Iran to like advocate, because you are literally asking them to potentially get executed in the process. All right. And it can never be my role as a Palestinian. This is the problem of intersectionality that I was referring to. I can never understand your situation like you can, and I can't define it. What was the second part of your question after boycott? Alternatives, yeah. Okay, so the recommendations, I can only speak from like my experience. And I want to always caution, because of that Achilles heel of intersectionality, I want to always caution against the apple-orange situation. Let's look at the Holocaust for an example. Nakba means catastrophe. Shoah means catastrophe. I can talk to Israelis and Jews until they're blue in the face about my problems. Suffering is relative to the individual and the community. The only way to figure out like a pathway forward is to understand the other's circumstance. To the extent that intersectionality can be supportive, can help like restrain the improper utilization of somebody else's movement for their own aggrandizement, but be supportive, networking, resources, all of that. That's I think very good. Organizations, though, movements, they need to like control who's really their voice. We don't have to speak long to anyone about BLM for people to say BLM was co-opted, right? This has nothing to do with the intrinsic value of BLM, right? But a lot of people get on board, right? And then they can like assist in the destruction, even unknowingly, for people who are actually hostile to the concept of, the BLM movement. So my recommendation is that organizations really need to understand what the people on the ground want. They need to remember that there is a taxonomy, a hierarchy of what people in the diaspora do versus not. And for us, one of the great complexities of the Gaza war is that the organizations saying they represent our rights don't even represent the PLO. They don't even recognize it. For 40 years, we fought for recognition. We finally got recognition. And now in the infancy of that recognition, an Islamist movement grew, which, by the way, comes from the outside, not from the inside. Okay, it comes from Egypt, right? And Iran is playing a central role, and this isn't even the Muslim Brotherhood role. It's the Shiite revolutionary concept, which is currently backing the regime in Iran and is the lifeblood of the regime in Iran, right? And, this is really problematic that the younger generation of students in this room thinks that the people fighting in Gaza right now are the people who actually like built the resistance against Israel. They don't even recognize the accepted organizational revolutionary structure. And by the way, they killed a lot of people in 2007 when they took over. And I want to be clear. I worked at Islamic University of Gaza when I was in, Gaza. I know the people. It was the most professional run institution in Gaza. And I said, look, they're going to take over the Strip. People laughed at the time. They're like, oh, they'll never take over the Strip. 3 years later, they took over the Strip. They're highly organized. It doesn't necessarily make them bad people, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're representing all the people's interests at all. Islamism as a concept, as a resistance concept, is relatively new in history. It's relatively new even in the Palestinian resistance. And there are a lot of people who don't necessarily accept that version of resistance. We had to shut down our program in 2007 for girls. You have my answer there, right? We didn't before Hamas took over. Nobody asked us to. It was implicit. And this shows how much that ideology has already won in many respects, right? It was implicit. We shut it down to protect the girls who were in the program from what would come towards them.
If I may, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is we should be really selective with who it is and which movements we are choosing to get involved with to make sure that they're actually aligned for everyone's best interests and not just one.
Yeah, and I would encourage anyone dealing with Israel-Palestine to move away from ideas of like correct you if you're wrong, or like it's never my job to tell you you're wrong, right? I think that's exactly right. Intersectionality needs to be very careful about choosing who they work with. I saw the anti-Semites coming through the door a long time ago in the late 1990s, when it began to be okay. Remember that it's only the Oslo Accords that made it okay to start siding with the Palestinians, right? And so a lot of people came in who weren't necessarily actually advocates for the Palestinian cause, but have created a lot of issues, right?
So this question is for Mr. Simpson. As a soccer player myself, I find it really like interesting and cool how you compared like soccer to like defiance. And I was wondering if like you see anything like that like in like nowadays on the world stage, or if it's more like a business now because of how politics kind of come into that.
Sure. Great question. Great question. I think keep moving that over. I don't know why. I should just go with this. Give me a second to think about that. But maybe the points of inspiration nowadays would be the folks who've come from the poorest conditions. For instance, Luka Modric, right? As a refugee of the Yugoslavian Civil War, he's got a unique perspective. He's now about 40, I think, still playing at a very top level. But when you listen to interviews with him, he gets it. He understands. He's also had many teammates of all sorts of different backgrounds. And it's these individual players who come from nothing that I think we ought to listen to. You get a lot of Brazilian players this way as well, right, who learn to play on the streets, basically. And that's true for a lot of international players. But that's where I think the best hope comes from in terms of seeing the purer side of the game, because of course the money is astronomical. If you think the NFL is big, international football is even bigger, I think, statistically, but it's all the same sort of pie, I guess. So for me, it'd be those individual stories. Yeah, it's not in America, sadly. And that's not necessarily to be, self-loathing or anything, but we're caught up in that same financial trap. We're pretty material. I'm going to go on a little sermonette here. We're pretty materialistic, right? And I think you see that embedded in how we do our socially curated lives and all of that. So I'll keep that to a minimum. But I think it's those folks who come from nothing that can speak to us better. What do you think, actually? I'd love to hear that.
I agree with you. I agree with you in the fact that it's kind of like those inspirational stories. I think the main one I think of is like Cristiano Ronaldo, where he came from like Madeira, like the tiny island off of Portugal, and he just made it to be like one of, if not the best player of all time. But like nowadays, I think I see less of like, I hear more about the individual like come up stories rather than like teams rallying together to like fight an issue, or like clubs coming together to fight an issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of like the problem that like I'm focused on because of like how closely like tied like politics are in sports. I mean, I think like a week or two ago in the Champions League, Aston Villa, an English club, was set to play a Israeli club, and the like Aston Villa denied sales to like Israeli fans to come see the game. So it's kind of like that intersectionality with politics.
It is.
That's like really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. The other part that goes with that is there's, I think, a bit of selective outrage that goes with this too, because Israel is obviously got a target of sorts, and there are certainly challenges in talking about or thinking about how the last 2 years have played out, right, in terms of the Israeli response. But that preceded October 7th. The pressures against Israeli football in particular preceded October 7th in particular. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
So at the very beginning of the summit, I know that Red mentioned sports as a battleground for radicalization, and specifically trans athletes in sports as a topic being used to sort of lead people into that right-wing radicalization indoctrination. I was wondering, based on some of the things you touched on during this panel, if you think that sport can also be a force for prevention or even de-radicalization in youth as sort of a substitute for those sorts of outrage and radical youth groups as an alternative form of community.
Another great question. I would say it happens at the academy level. So if you have, this is actually where we could influence the process. When you talk about institutions, catch them when they're young. One of the colleagues that I developed a friendship with in Slovakia, he's director of the Jewish Museum there, and the exhibit we worked on together during my Fulbright and thereafter involved a Jewish player who became a coach of the Austrian national team. He had to live through both the Nazi times and the communist times, and they brought in, or my colleague brought in academy players from one of the best Slovak clubs in the land. And I see this also in Germany with Borussia Dortmund. There's a club called FC Pauli that does the same sort of thing. And they do this kind of institutional, educational sort of effort at the youngest ages, and they're almost always through football academies, because often then you're getting a wonderful mix of maybe Turkish immigrant kids with native German kids who maybe been there for decades and centuries. And we see the same thing, I think, here in the U.S. I've coached a bit on the academy level in Portland, and then where I live in the Midwest in Arkansas. And that, for me, has always been the leveling play field. I know that sounds a little idealistic, but when I hear these boys interact with each other, the first Trump administration, for instance, some of them were genuinely worried about deportation. They didn't understand the complexity of it because they were, I think, 13 or 14 at the time, but there was something in the air, more than something in the air, but they understood the perils. And to hear them interact with each other without us getting involved as coaches, and as a psychology professor having to be a coach, that was really encouraging. I've seen this when we've taken students to Guatemala, to Poland. We roll a ball out. Again, it sounds a little cliche, but it's true. This is a game that's leveling, and kids sort it out. They sort out differences with each other. They learn how to handle and tolerate difference. So again, it's not a kumbaya kind of moment, but soccer matters in that regard, I would say, and catch them when they're early.
We have time for one more question.
Just to add to that question, yeah, I think that I totally agree with the question. I like it. When we look at what's happening in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, even Ghana, places like that, what we've found is that the responsibility can be shared. It's not just the players, the coaches, and the owners. Sometimes it's even the parents. So just to flesh out the full sports ecosystem, there's a number of parents organizations where mothers, fathers have learned how to become agents. They've learned the business of sport, and they've sort of respected the fact that a lot of the youth that are involved in sport are not fully developed. So, I mean, none of us have a fully developed frontal cortex until the age of about 25, and that's the CEO of the brain. So obviously, we have to account for the fact that athletes who are in youth sport are not fully human developed. Their development pathway does not track their sport development pathway, and take accountability. The adults in the room, owners and coaches, yes, but also the parents and the friends and the pastors and the community organizers who are interfacing with these youth every day. So from our context, with the African Union Sports Council, we find that a lot of the parents and the community organizers end up taking on that accountability of trying to imbue certain values in youth athletes that would essentially do the opposite of what was described earlier by Red.
Look, catch them while they're young. There's a case in my book where the tower of the YMCA in Jerusalem is used to snipe at Jewish soldiers in the War of Independence. And the Haganah, it's actually Stern Gang, the people who were considered the terrorists of the time, right, by the British, come to basically seize the building and take it over. Until today, that building is an American building, all right? It's one of the most strategic properties in West Jerusalem. The person who intervenes is a Maccabi athlete who used to play with, Christians and Muslims. And he is the person who prevents the YMCA being taken over by the Stern Gang.
I think I'm going to have to call it, and I encourage all of you to perhaps approach our panelists at the coffee break. This morning we talked about the behemoth of billionaires and everyone having a price. I found that quite depressing to leave that there, but I think this panel has offered powerful antidotes about the power and the possibility of creating culturally responsive data sets, of acknowledging survival as perhaps the most powerful and important part of resistance, the importance of dignity and self-care, mental health, the power of personal testimony and narrative, and perhaps leaving us this afternoon with thinking about a future of sport that is athlete-led, as you graciously said, and the possibility of building more just sports futures that's based on community and reciprocity and not just thinking about what the behemoths are doing. Thank you so much for your attendance. And thank you to our panelists.
Yes, thank you to the panelists and Fiona. We will reconvene at 3:15 for our final panel of the day, but please enjoy the break and keep the conversations going.